Hey YouTubers, and welcome back to my YouTube channel, Master That English, where we understand, analyze, and interpret the important texts and concepts that may be part of your English curriculum. Our topic for today will be the analysis of the work written by Thomas Hardy, which is Tess of the D'Urbervilles, which was published in the year 1891. So get your pens and notepads ready because here we go. Before we analyze this work, it is important to understand who is Thomas Hardy. Thomas Hardy was a Victorian English novelist, poet, and architect. Yes, I know all of you are surprised who are listening about this writer for the first time. Thomas Hardy was also an architect first, a writer later. This is what gives him a unique characteristic in his writing style. Just like an architect creates a blueprint, Hardy also created a blueprint for his work, where his characters would feature. That was his fictional town, Wessex. He was influenced both in his novels and in his poetry by Romanticism, including the poetry of William Wordsworth, and is regarded as one of the greatest writers of the Victorian era. He was born in June 2nd, 1840 in Higher Bockington, England, and died in January 11th, 1928. Hardy did not attend university because of financial limitations. He became an apprentice architect at the age of 16 in Dorsetshire and later worked in London. In 1870, while restoring a church in Cromwell, Hardy met Emma Gifford, fell in love, and married her in 1874. Despite opposition from both families, their early marriage was happy. However, as Hardy became more famous, their relationship gradually deteriorated. Emma's death in 1912 had a traumatic effect on him, and Hardy made a trip to Cromwell after her death to revisit places linked with their courtship. He wrote some of his finest elegiac poems in English, including the famous poems of 1912 to 13 that reflect upon her death. He remained preoccupied with his first wife's death and tried to overcome his remorse by writing poetry. In 1914, Hardy married his secretary, Florence Emily Dugdale, who was 39 years his junior. She cared for him in his later years. While working as an architect, he developed a passion for literature and began writing novels and poems. Hardy received many literary honors, including the Order of Merit in 1910. He writes on theme of fate, social class, love, marriage, religion, and the struggles of ordinary people. What is his contribution to English literature? Hardy wrote 14 published novels and around 50 short stories, most of which were published in 4 collections. We had the Wessex Tales that included 7 stories. A group of noble dames had 10 stories. Life's Little Ironies had 8 stories. A Changed Man and Other Tales had 12 stories. Some of his best known works include Far from the Madding Crowd, The Mayor of Casterbridge, Tess of the D'Urbervilles, and Jude the Obscure. And he also wrote one monumental verse drama, The Dynasts, from 1904 to 1908, which was a 3-part epic verse. It was a drama about the Napoleonic Wars. You may be curious to know, why did Hardy devote much of his career to poetry than prose? Tess of the D'Urbervilles and Jude the Obscure were initially criticized because they challenged the moral and religious values of Victorian society. In Tess, Hardy presented a woman who was sexually exploited as morally pure, exposing the unfair treatment of women and criticizing the church's lack of compassion. The novel also attacked the double standard that excused men's sexual behavior while condemning women. In his last prose work, Jude the Obscure, Hardy questioned the sanctity of marriage, criticized religious and educational institutions, and portrayed relationships outside marriage sympathetically. These ideas were considered shocking and immoral by many Victorian readers. The severe criticism of Jude the Obscure was so intense that Hardy stopped writing novels and turned exclusively to poetry. Thereafter, he devoted much of his career to poetry. You would be surprised to know that he wrote nearly 1,000 poems and is considered one of the most important English poets of the early 20th century. So, why is his work important? Hardy's work bridged the gap between Victorian literature and modern literature. His realistic portrayal of social problems and his often tragic view of human life influenced many later writers. One of his most famous quotes is,
Time changes everything except something within us, which is always surprised by change.
it is important to know what made him popular during his time. Thomas Hardy became popular because he wrote realistic and emotionally powerful stories about ordinary rural people. His vivid portrayal of Wessex, his fictional town that I mentioned as his architectural blueprint, and his memorable characters, strong female protagonists, and social criticism, along with his poetic style, attracted a wide readership. The serial publication of his novels in magazines further increased his popularity during the Victorian era. And this is what makes his style uniquely distinguished from his contemporaries. The fact that he wrote during the Victorian era, Thomas Hardy was different from many Victorian writers because he questioned the optimistic view of society and progress that was common in his age. While many 19th century novelists believed that education, morality, and social reform would improve human life, he challenged the optimistic and moralistic views common in Victorian literature. Hardy's style that distinguished him from other contemporaries was his realistic portrayal of rural life of common people in the fictional region of Wessex. His novels are filled with vivid descriptions of nature that reflect the emotions and lives of his character. It's almost like a pastoral poetry where you get to sense the aesthetic of rural life. The natural objects, seasons, and settings often symbolize characters, emotions, destiny, or moral conflicts in his novels. Unlike many Victorian writers, Hardy often showed that innocent people suffer because of fate, chance, or an indifferent universe. He challenged rigid social conventions and explored the inner thoughts, emotions, and moral dilemmas of his characters in great detail. While writers popularly known at the time included Charles Dickens and George Eliot, who often showed societies improving through morality and hard work, Hardy portrayed life as harsh, uncertain, and often controlled by fate. Now let us try to understand how did Hardy's personal life influence Tess of the D'Urbervilles. Hardy himself grew up in rural Dorset. That fact inspired the setting of Wessex and its villages. He saw poverty among rural workers that is reflected in Tess's struggle with poverty and labor. His concern for women treated unfairly is seen when Tess becomes a victim of patriarchal society. He doubts about religion and fate to highlight the conflict between human will and destiny. His emotional disappointment in his marriage to his first wife can be seen in Tess through the themes of love, regret, and failed relationships. His love for nature is evident in Tess as nature is portrayed as both beautiful and indifferent. So it is important to understand the concept of Wessex that I mentioned was the blueprint for his fictional work. Wessex is the fictional region where most of Hardy's novels are set. Although based on the real counties of southwestern England, Hardy transformed them into an imaginative literary landscape. So much was his obsession for Wessex that in his later years, he kept a wire fork terrier named Wessex. So even his dog was named Wessex, who was notoriously ill tempered. Woof to that. Wessex gravestone can be found on the Max Gate grounds even today. Isn't that interesting? And truly an obsession for a place. So, what is Wessex? Historically, we see the reference of Wessex as an Anglo Saxon kingdom in southern England. Hardy revived the name and used it for a fictional version of rural England. It mainly corresponds to the counties of Dorset, Somerset, Wiltshire, Hampshire, Devon, and Berkshire. So, why did he create this Wessex in the first place? It's very simple. Just like an architect creates a blueprint to ensure that everything is foundationally right, he too wanted to unify his novels. By setting many stories in the same region, he created a connected fictional world. This does remind me of the Indian writer R.K. Narayan, who also had a fictional town called Malgudi. Narayan also wanted to write about the simplistic way in which people lived, and Hardy also wanted to preserve the rural life and wanted to record the traditions, customs, and way of life that were disappearing because of industrialization. That was the hallmark of the Victorian age. He wanted to make local stories universal through the settings that are specific, through the themes of love, suffering, fate, and social injustice that apply everywhere. What is interesting in the title of the work is the subtitle. He uses the subtitle, A Pure Woman. Why a subtitle like that? Despite the fact that Victorian age was the time when moral standards were very high. Hardy's subtitle, A Pure Woman's Faithfully Presented, is a direct protest against Victorian morality. According to Victorian standards, a woman's purity depended on her sexual chastity. Hardy calls Tess a pure woman, which is in stark contrast to the standards of Victorian society. Because he believes purity is determined by inner goodness, honesty, compassion, and moral integrity, not by sexual experience. By giving the novel this subtitle, Hardy breaks the social convention of living by the definition that the Victorian society had made. He exposes the hypocrisy of a society that punishes women while excusing men. Now, I think it's the right time for us to understand the beautiful way in which Hardy has composed his entire story. So let us begin with the summary of Tess of the D'Urbervilles. How does the story start? Like I said, his novels are in a form of a blueprint. where the locations are first structured and then the story and characters take life. So it is interesting to see how every location stands out differently and tells an important transition that takes place in Tess's life. We begin with the very rural setting where Tess is living the simple and easy life that people in the rural area lead. What we notice here first is the life of Tess and her family members, where we get to know about the D'Urberville heritage. In Victorian society, name and position had a lot of value. In the village of Marlott, one evening, Tess's father, John Duberfield, a poor peddler, is stopped by a parson, Tringham, an amateur historian. The parson tells him that he is the last descendant of the once powerful D'Urberville family, an ancient Norman noble family. John becomes proud, excited by this discovery. Instead of working, he spends his time drinking at Rover's Inn and dreaming of lost nobility. His wife, Joan Duberfield, believing this noble connection could improve their fortunes, persuades their eldest daughter, Tess D'Urberfield, to visit a wealthy family called Stoke Ubervilles, hoping they are their relatives. In the first part, we notice how the rural people are influenced by the idea of reputation, which was an important hallmark of the Victorian society. But this greed that starts in the family eventually brings in a bad fate for all of them. Because what we notice is that night, Tess is driving her family car to the market because the father is drunk. And when she falls asleep from exhaustion, the family's only horse, Prince, is accidentally killed by a speeding mail cart. The death of Prince is devastating because the horse was the only source of income. Feeling guilty, Tess agrees to visit Stoke D'Urbervilles to help support her family. This is how the maiden life of Tess is disrupted by the sheer idea of pressure for financial stability. We now go to the second segment, which is phase two, and it is titled Maiden No More. This is where we notice that the wealthy stroked Ubervilles are not the true descendants of the ancient family. Their ancestors simply brought the prestigious surname. In a way, we get to see the hypocrisy of the Victorian society. That even though surnames and titles are important, it's not important to have it as the true bloodline for your surname. So when Tess meets Alec d'Urberville, the young son of the family, Alec is a handsome, wealthy, confident, and manipulative man. He immediately becomes attracted to Tess and begins pursuing her despite her discomfort. Tess starts caring for poultry at the Stopes, his family estate, and throughout her stay, we notice that this man, Alec, constantly flirts with Tess, ignoring her refusals. He showers her with gifts and attention, but Tess remains uncomfortable because she does not love him.
But I don't want anybody to kiss me, sir.
She implored, a big tear beginning to roll down her face and the corners of her mouth trembling in her attempt not to cry. Hardy shows the helplessness that Tess undergoes as a woman. She is burdened by the pressure. Alec d'Urberville regularly accuses Tess d'Urberfield of being temptress. However, Tess at this time is ignoring all the advances that he is making because she's a young 16-year-old girl. Tess is not mentally prepared to handle men like Alec, who are smart and know how to manipulate women who are damsel and innocent since they belong to the rural setting where the ways of the urban society, where you have to be sharp, intelligent to handle situation, is not there in her as of now. She has not matured with the experience of the urban world. And as the story proceeds, in the chase, which is the next segment, we notice how her fate eventually takes a down toll again. As one evening, Tess has to attend a village fair with other workers. In that particular event, a quarrel breaks out between the village girls over Alex's attention towards Tess. So the women start teasing Tess in most harsh way. With this kind of humiliation, Tess decides to walk home alone through the woods called the chase. This is where Alec catches up with her on a horseback. Lost in the foggy forest, Tess becomes exhausted and falls asleep. And this is where the advantage of her helplessness, Alec sexually assaults Tess. Hardy deliberately leaves the incident indirect, but it permanently changes Tess's life. This moment becomes the central tragedy of the novel. When Tess leaves Tantridge and returns to her home in Marlotte following the sexual assault at the end of her employment with the D'Urbervilles, what we see here is the manipulative nature of Alec. He accepts his folly. He accepts the kind of man he is, who is manipulative and tries to exploit innocent young girls.
I was born bad. I had lived bad, and I shall die bad in all probability. But upon my last soul, I won't be bad towards you again, Tess.
Tess does return home emotionally devastated. But this tragic event has brought about another bad news alongside with it, as she is carrying the child of Alec. She gives birth to the baby boy and names him Sorrow. The child becomes ill shortly after birth. Since the local church refuses to baptize an illegitimate child, Tess performs the baptism herself. But soon afterwards, Sorrow dies. And the church refuses now to even give a Christian burial to this child. These events reveal the cruelty and hypocrisy of Victorian religious society. After mourning her child, Tess decides to rebuild her life by moving to another location. This is the third phase that is titled The Rally. Tess has now decided to have a fresh beginning. And for this, she leaves home and finds work at Talbot's Dairy, a peaceful and fertile farm. Look at the way how Hardy has skillfully used the location, which is very thematic to the way in which the character is undergoing changes. Since the nature here is pleasant, you notice that unlike the previous location, Tess is more comfortable here. And this is the place where she meets the true love of her life, Angel Clare, the educated son of a clergyman. What is interesting to see in Angel is that he is a progressive modern man of the present time. As, unlike his brothers, Angel rejects the church and wishes to become a farmer. Angel had briefly noticed Tess years earlier during the May Day dance, but had not spoken to her. Now he falls deeply in love with her. The dairy workers like Marion, Retty, and Ishut also loved Angel. And in spite of all this admiration, Angel chose Tess. Tess loves Angel too, but she is haunted by her past with Alec. Several times, she attempts to confess the truth before marriage. She even slips a confession letter under Angel's bedroom door. Unfortunately, the letter slides under the carpet and Angel never sees it. This missed confession becomes one of the novel's greatest examples of cruel fate. But the question is, why does this really happen with Tess? Is it to gain maturity since she is still innocent in her face? As the story proceeds, in phase 4, which is titled The Consequence, we notice that the lovers have finally got closer and Angel proposes marriage to Tess. But Tess repeatedly refuses because she fears about revealing her past and knows that Angel still doesn't know about the tragic event that happened with her. But after their wedding, what we notice as an interesting point here is that before Tess confesses, Angel also has a secret, where he confesses that he once had a brief affair with an older woman in London. And Tess forgives him immediately. Encouraged by his honesty, Tess tells him about Alec as well. But this is where we notice that her truth turns out to be a curse again. Angel is not forgiving her. In fact, he is horrified.
How can we live together while that man lives? He's being your husband in nature and not I. If he were dead, I might be different.
Such a statement tells a lot about the way in which a man would think during the Victorian age. Angel Clare believes that marital relations are what make Alec, the man who raped her, her husband. Although he admits his own mistake, he cannot forgive Tess because Victorian society would judge women more harshly than men. Angel calls her another woman from the one he imagined. The marriage effectively ends on the wedding night. And now Angel cannot bear to be around Tess. So he leaves England for Brazil, hoping time will help him overcome his feelings. And this is how Tess returns alone. She works now in a miserable farm, Flintcombe Ash, which is again having a different theme attached to it, where conditions are harsh and exhausting. Here she works as a farm laborer, digging swathes, harvesting grain, making roof thatch, and later feeding a steam-powdered threshing machine. The work is extremely hard, done in freezing weather for low wages. Hardy uses these harsh tasks to symbolize Tess's suffering, poverty, and endurance after her separation from Angel. Hardy contrasts this beautiful Talbothaise with industrialized, unforgiving agriculture. Meanwhile, we also get to know that Angel is now suffering terribly in Brazil. The climate is unhealthy, his farming venture fails over there, and with time he gradually realizes that he judged Tess unfairly. So now he decides to return to England and seek forgiveness. But in phase 6, things are about to change again for Tess. As The Convert is the name of this segment. There is the return of the villain, Alec, again. Alec reappears now, pretending to be a religious preacher after experiencing a conversion. And he unexpectedly meets Tess again. His feelings return when he looks at Tess. He abandons religion and begins pursuing her once again. Even at this time, Tess is still not interested in Alec.
Oh, will you go away for the sake of me and my husband? Go! In the name of your own Christianity!
Tess knows how relentless Alec is, but she is 4 years older now, and she appeals to his recent religious conversion in the hope that it will make him go away. She remains loyal to Angel despite being abandoned, but she is again forced to change her mind. There is another sad news. Tess's father is no more. The D'Urberfield family loses their cottage and becomes homeless. This is how there is a moral compromise for Tess. She is facing poverty and the responsibility of her younger siblings. Tess finally gives in and becomes Alec's companion, believing she has no other way to support her family. In phase 7, we see fulfillment, where Angel returns to England, now mature and remorseful. He realizes Tess has always been morally pure, and he finally understands the injustice of his earlier judgment. He searches desperately for her. When he reaches the sandbone, he discovers Tess living with Alec. Angel leaves heartbroken. This is when Tess suddenly realizes that Alec's lies convinced her Angel would never return. Feeling trapped and betrayed, Tess blames Alec for ruining her life twice. In a moment of intense despair, she kills Alec by stabbing him. This murder is the climax of the novel. And finally, once Tess has committed the crime that is a legal offense, we come to the final portions, which are titled as Reconciliation. After killing Alec, Tess runs away with Angel. This is where we see that for the first time, Angel accepts Tess even after she commits this heinous crime. This is for the first time we see Angel accepting Tess even though she has gone against the norms of the society.
I do love you, Tess, so I do. It is all come back.
A few days, they experience the happiness they had always desired. They travel across the countryside until they reach Stonehenge. There, Tess lies down in one of the ancient altar stones and falls asleep peacefully. Stonehenge symbolizes fate, sacrifice, and ancient civilization. When the police arrive, Tess quietly accepts arrest without resistance. She seems almost relieved that her long suffering is ending. And in the final segment, that is titled The Execution and Salvation, Angel and Tess's younger sister, Lisa Lou, watch from a distant hillside near the prison. A black flag is raised above the prison, indicating Tess has been executed. The novel ends with Angel silently taking Lisa Lou's hand, and Hardy writes that justice was done, placing the word in quotation marks to question whether the society's justice is truly just. This heartfelt story has an important role to play in the Victorian society. But what is interesting to see as we were navigating through the story, we saw that different parts of Wessex feature a backdrop in Tess's life. Tess is moving through different parts, where her home village, Marlotte, represents innocence. This is the place where Tess is carefree, she's innocent, she's closely connected with nature. The bright countryside reflects the beginning of life. That is the purity that Tess had. But as we keep moving to different locations, the second location where she meets Alec, which is Tantridge, this is where her innocence is lost. The dark woods and lonely roads reflect fear and destruction of innocence. So the blueprint of the location is a representation of the change of fate that is bound to happen with Tess. It almost reminds us of the levels of hell that we see in Dante's Inferno, where level 1 is just the beginning. So the moment she leaves the village, which is the pure haven, she, in the modern world, is going through the modern inferno, where every level starts getting uglier and uglier till eventually she has to give in to her innocence and surrender to the norms of the modern world, which is, if she doesn't live by their standards, she has to eventually undergo through her loss of life. So, even after Tantridge, the third location, which is Talbothays, wherever we see a pastoral setting which is lush, green, we see a blossom in Tess's life. But the very next location, which was Flintcomb Ash, this is where hardships and suffering tend to get more. Here we notice even the weather is harsh, the fields are barren, and machines almost mirror Tess's emotional pain. Human beings appear powerless before both nature and society in areas where there is no trace of life as is represented in the rural settings, which were lush, green. That is where love blossomed. That is where innocence was there at its bounty. Even in Sanborn, where the novel reaches its tragic conclusion as Tess's last hopes are destroyed, despair and moral compromise is noticed here. The fashionable town contrasts sharply with Tess's inner misery. The outward comfort hides inner suffering. And Kingspere, where she has acceptance of her fate, that is the place where her journey ends. Tess confronts her family's past and recognizes that ancestry provides no escape from fate. So, where in the urban world, where the focus is always on your reputation, the image that you carry, it all makes no sense to a simple person living in the rural setting. This is what we learn by the end of this story. And that is how Hardy uses the landscape. He almost tries to explain this, that the natural world is a symbolic map of Tess's inner life. Her inner life is green, a fertile landscape. She has hope, love, and innocence, and renewal of living a better life even when she is about to die. She expects that at least peace will come now. And the outside world, which is dark, barren, artificial landscape, that truly is the cause of the downfall, or maybe the force of attracting the bad fate that causes fear, suffering, alienation, and despair in her life. So, through this trajectory, the blueprint that off and on goes from good locations like Marlott to bad locations like Tantridge, Whitcomb Ash, Kingswear, and Sanborn, we get to see Tess's journey from innocence to experience, from hope to despair, and finally to a tragic fate. So, this is how the settings, which were the blueprint for this fictional town, are so important for understanding the true course of this tragic fall for Tess. We also are some way more inclined towards the modern advances that were taking place at the time. Was Hardy only against the urbanized living lifestyles, or there was something else that he was trying to move towards? For instance, Victorian age was also a time when scientific inventions were leading at the time. And we had concepts of evolution as were profoundly stated by the concept of Charles Darwin, theory of evolution. In his work on the origin of species that was published in the year 1859, we get an important insight that is also visible in Hardy's work, where Darwin had argued that life develops through natural selection rather than through fixed divine plan. Hardy also adopted this modern perspective in his work. As in his work also, we get to see a new way of thinking where the belief that life is often controlled by chance, fate, and heredity, and circumstances are more profoundly to be seen than divine justice. In Tess of the D'Urbervilles, Tess is kind, honest, and morally pure. Yet she suffers throughout her life because of poverty, accidents, social prejudice. This is what is the present world. This is how the world is evolving. You cannot sustain by these traits. You have to survive through the survival skills, which include monetary benefits. That is the only way you can protect yourself. The good, simple nature of the village and the rural people holds no value in the present time. So, through this contrast, we get to see where people like Alec are able to exploit Tess and escape punishment throughout the course of the novel until the time when Tess murders him. We get to see that Hardy is showing that life is not always fair and good people will suffer in this Darwinian world. The wrongdoers are going to prosper because they are the one who are holding the survival kit. That is money and financial independence. That is what makes these people lead over the simple people living in the rural area. This also highlights, to a certain extent, the literary movement that was very popular in the Victorian age, that was naturalism, which sees human life as being shaped by forces beyond individual control. So here, people are not in control of their destiny because the world around them, their family background, and unexpected events is what that controls their life through the long course. And that is the reason why all these factors are very important in shaping Tess's life and making her a tragic character. Through this work, we also get to understand the Victorian society, where there is a class distinction. We have an upper class known as the aristocrats, who are aristocrats not because of their name, but because of the financial security and the materialistic gain that they have brought in. And it doesn't matter if these people have certain level of legacy attached with them or not, as was seen in the case of Alec. We also have middle class people who are very sensitized. For them, moral constraints does not allow them to think emotionally and give importance to their feelings, as was in the case of Angel Clare, who belongs to an educated and respectable class but does not have the strength to pay attention to his own feelings. This is how the working class, which is the farmers and laborers, as was seen in the case of Tess, they are the ones who struggle the most. And the rich people like Alec prosper because they have what it takes to undergo any kind of change in their life. We also get to see in the Victorian society the various roles that women need to abide by. There are expectations in this Victorian society. You have to be obedient, you have to be a dutiful wife, obedient daughter, sacrificing mother, you have to be morally pure, you have to face the problems by accepting your fate. And there is a limited education that is available for women, which is why they are not able to understand the ways of the rakes like Alec. They have few employment opportunities, which is why they are only stuck with menial jobs. And they are always financially dependent on men because their salaries cannot scale up to the way in which Alec was able to manipulate and force Tess to be with him all the time. This is how we see the double standards of the society where lesser opportunities do not permit women to take part in the things that they truly want and aspire to do in life. They cannot lead with the feelings that they have. They are always dependent on people around them. We also understand the marriage laws, which are so strict And that is what decides the treatment you will get. Just because Tess is not married, she is not given a respectable place in the society. People do not give her the due that she deserves. Divorce at this time was very rare, and in fact, it was expensive and socially unacceptable. So, a woman's legal identity was largely merged with her husband's after marriage. Marriage often determined a woman's social and financial security, and chastity was an important hallmark of making the marriage a successful one. And this is how we noticed the social hypocrisy when it comes to the idea of gender, especially for women in this particular timeline. Throughout this novel, what I think is also important to understand is the convention with which Hardy was also creating a very unconventional tragic hero than the classical modes with which a hero was represented. For the Victorian society, in the classical convention, a tragic hero had to be of a noble birth, which was the most important guideline given by the Greek philosopher Aristotle. But our Tess does not belong to the wealthy, noble family that Aristotle was talking about. She only has the family name that was recognized at one point of time back in the history. But she doesn't fall under the bracket of the wealthy people in the urban society in the Victorian age. That is what makes her unconventional. Hardy diversifies his narrative from the way in which a tragic hero should be represented. We notice that the realization in a character was the most important hallmark in a tragedy, which was termed as anagnorisis, which is recognition, where you understand the truth. But what we notice in the case of Tess is that her lesson doesn't end with one. There are multiple things that she has to learn in this modern world, coming from an innocent phase in her life. At a very young age, at 16 itself, she understands and is forced to bend to the social norms where she has to be sacrificed for every need that the family expects, the society expects, and which is why one lifetime is not enough for her to go through this recognition. Her maturity only comes in the end, when she has to give in her life, when she realizes only after death will she get the true peace that she was looking for all her life. So yes, to a certain level, her hamartia was not that we see in a tragic character. The tragic flaw in her is her innocence. Unlike the flaws that we saw in the Greek characters or the Renaissance characters who could not understand the flaw that they had. Tess could not understand the ways of the world, and her good nature becomes her hamartia. The only principle that the story follows in relation to the tragic theme represented by Aristotle is there is suffering. But there is no catharsis here. We don't learn the lesson from Tess as is represented by the Victorian society. We only get a mature mindset where we understand that the ways of the world are very important to survive and lead in life. If we don't, and if we stay naive and are living in a fool's innocent world of our own, then that ignorance is not going to be bliss in a world that we live if it is like the Victorian society. It is very important to understand this work on that perspective. It is important to understand that women need to mature themselves early in life if they have to work and be independent as individuals tomorrow. Otherwise, they would always be gaslighted by men like Alec. They will always be dominated by men like Angel, who are living by the social protocols and do not have the strength to hear and listen to their own voice. So a woman only learns through this novel. We don't go through a catharsis. Because if we go through a catharsis, we are also turning out to be as innocent as the character Tess. And that is what Hardy did not expect us to do. We are not supposed to learn something from Tess by imitation. We have to learn something from Tess as an evolutionary process where all of us have to mature and understand the ways of the world in order to lead a more stronger, progressive life for ourselves tomorrow. This is how we can definitely receive justice. And in the present day, if we have to talk about Tess as a work, do you think in this world, the 21st century, Tess would receive justice? Yes, she would receive justice, but that will only be possible if she is socially aware about the rights that are provided to her by the legal system. In the Victorian time, women were not aware because they were not moving outside the four walls. They were only asked to do things that the family made them do. But in today's world, a woman can move out, do things that she wants to do, has the support of the family, is financially secure. But is that enough? No. You need to have the awareness that Tess didn't have. You need to have realization of the fact that there are men like Alec who are there to exploit innocent girls who are not aware about the ways with which they are exploited if they do not understand their ways. You have to be strong in a world like today as well. This is where I think this work by Hardy is definitely a very important, significant work that is a classic even for today. We learn something essential as growing and maturing with time, but through awareness. And that is what makes a pure woman today pure, which is by true idea of awareness and the idea of understanding one's individuality without having to surrender yourself to the ways in which people who are close to you manipulate you in unethical ways. And with that, we come to the end of this lecture. I hope you have enjoyed this classic work where we analyzed the summary, but most importantly, we spoke about a very different form of representation of the time when it was written. And that is what I feel happens with people who come from interdisciplinary backgrounds, is that they are able to give a new insight into the way in which the society lives, because there is so much they get to see, explore, and create, unlike the ways in which writers at that time were writing. That was just to impress and entertain. But Hardy was not writing to impress. He was just trying to reflect the society in the way it is. Thank you for listening. Please share it with someone who you feel can benefit. If you feel that this lecture was helpful, do give it a like. Subscribe to my channel if you're new to it. And until next time, this is me, Karishma. Take care.